Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. On today's episode, we are building our Attention Economy Navigator for the month of May 2026. The goal of Block and Build has always been to help organizers figure out what's happening, how people are responding, and really get a sense for what's working out there in the world. The Attention Economy Navigator is our way of visually mapping some of the most and least talked about news stories of the month and help our audience orient towards what's worth your attention and what could use a little less. Here's how the Navigator works. My panel of guests, who you will meet in a moment, will work with me to plot some of the most and least discussed news stories from the past month onto a two-dimensional graph representing where we think they fall on a spectrum of signal versus noise on one axis and conspiracy versus reality on the other. If you'd like a visual, you can always watch this episode on YouTube or find the final graph in article form on our website. To explain this better, let's take a trip back to high school geometry and envision a standard XY graph. On the x-axis, we're measuring signal versus noise, with high signal being the furthest to the right and high noise being furthest to the left. Noisy stories are those with little meaning. They're part of the chatter, but they aren't going to stick with us, and they don't mean much to our long-term media and political environment. Contrast that with high signal stories, which have deep long-term implications and impact on our world. Then, of course, there's the y-axis. We're measuring consensus reality versus conspiracy theory. High reality stories are those that are really happening. These are based in hard reporting, they're rooted in consensus reality, and they're observable in the world. High conspiracy stories are those which are a little more, let's say, speculative. They might be actual conspiracy theories, or they might be based in broad conjectures. So this leaves us with four quadrants. The top right quadrant is high signal, high reality. These are the stories that are meaty and demand our attention, and which are both happening and mean something. Those that are high noise and high conspiracy fall in the bottom left and probably deserve a little less attention, even if people can't stop talking about them. High noise, high reality stories are the things that we don't think will last the media cycle, while high signal and high conspiracy stories are a particularly interesting category. They might be driven by conspiracy theory, but they do tell us something meaningful about the world that we live in. This finalized graph plot will be linked in the show notes and can be found on Convergence's website for you to follow along. You can also, of course, pop over to watch this episode on our YouTube channel, where producer Josh helps us lay out the graph in real time. To help build this month's Attention Economy Navigator, I am joined by cultural studies professor, writer, and the founder of PopSmart Media, Dr. Shannon Mancus, aka Dr. Shan. You can find some of her work where she studies the relationships between pop culture and politics, translating film, TV, and cultural theory to help people understand power, resist despair, and imagine better futures on her Instagram at PopSmart Media. Shan, thank you so much for making the time to join us today.
I'm so excited to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I'm also joined again by our managing editor here at Convergence, Akin Olla. Akin, thank you for joining us. I know you've had a busy week.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for forcing me to be here.
My pleasure. So we've already collected some headlines for discussion today, and I'll start out by having each of you introduce a story. We'll put 5 minutes on the clock and then talk about discussion and placement. Are y'all ready?
Yep.
Sure am.
All right. Well, Dr. Shan, let's start with one of your stories. One thing our listeners may not know about me is I dropped out of art school. And so I was really excited about the stories that you shared. And I had not even clocked that the Venice Biennale happened. Can you tell us a little bit about the US Pavilion, what is going on with this, and why you think this story matters?
Absolutely. So the Venice Biennale is currently happening. It runs from May to November. And for people who might not be familiar with it, the Biennale is the oldest and most prestigious contemporary art show in the world. And while that may sound kind of, like mattering only to people who are sort of in the very snooty echelons of the art world, it's really more like the Art Olympics every 2 years when it occurs. The way that it's structured, and it's been running since 1895, since the early 1900s, most countries have had a dedicated pavilion where they showcase their national art, and there's a competition and that kind of thing. So if you go to the Biennale, there's a whole section called the Giardini, which is just these little tiny buildings that are the different countries' exhibit spaces. It's almost like contemporary art Epcot, like the World Showcase at Epcot, if you've ever been there, right?
Yeah.
And so most often the art that they choose says something about the political moment in that country. And we've had some really exciting exhibitions over the last few years. I usually take students to the Biennale in the summers. And so I've gotten to see the last several of them, but I won't be there this year. The headlines about our involvement in the Biennale this year are mostly around how our art is tremendously boring, which I think is the autocratic impulse often is either very Baroque and over the top or very austere, right? This leans into an austere space. The artist is Alma Allen, and he is a sculptor. So the pavilion is fairly bare except for these sculptures that are abstract of various sizes that are all named, not yet titled. The selection of this artist was a mess. The Trump administration kicked out all of the national endowments for the arts people who are usually involved with our selection of an artist. And instead, this committee was formed called the American Arts Conservatory, which seems to be run by this woman named Jenny Perito, whose last job seemed to have been owning a pet food store. And the curator that was chosen is this fairly embattled figure named Jeffrey Uslip, who was fired from his last job for racial insensitivity in curating. So from the beginning, right?
Nightmare material here.
All nightmare material, start to ending. And we didn't even get interesting art out of it, right? Like there's not even anything sort of to dissect here. We've just got these large scale abstract sculptures, which I've heard people call plop art, like you plop them in places to make it look fancier, which I love that descriptor. I think it's really
funny.
But the thing that I think is interesting about the headlines, and it's like they're headlines because it's funny, right? It's funny to watch, I think, the administration try to have cultural capital and fail tremendously. But what is underneath this story, that I would love to hear more people talking about is the fact that we're there at all. And that Russia and Israel are back this year. So the last two times I've been to the Biennale, Russia has been excluded. In fact, there has been like partitions in front of their little building, right? It's very obvious and clear that they're not invited. They weren't invited. This year, the Biennale decided to have both Russia and Israel back, and the entire jury resigned in protest.
Wow.
That has never happened before in the nearly 150 years that the Biennale has been running. It happened just a couple of days before the exhibition started. And so the Biennale committee had to scramble to try to figure out an alternate adjudication system, which seems like it's kind of patchwork, but is also relying on visitors for their input for the first time. And to me, that's the story that I wish I was getting more attention here.
There's like so many layers to this story. I mean, I'm curious what you think this selection of this artist kind of means, and like in terms of how we can also like in terms of like how other countries maybe are understanding the role of the US on the world stage, right? That like does it seem like this feels like a reflection of like empire in decline? Like what is the read that you're seeing?
It almost feels isolationist to me. Like I know that our current politics aren't isolationist, but in terms of how this compares to previous years, it feels like a retreat. So in the past 10 or 15 years, we've had things outside of our pavilion. I think the most striking thing that I've seen there is an overturned tank. So complete full-sized real tank completely flipped upside down with a treadmill on top and one of our Olympians running on the treadmill powering the treads of the tank. That same exhibition had an organ that contained an ATM, and the only way you could make the organ play music was to withdraw money from the ATM. So we've had clever things like that. The last Biennale featured this really incredible collection of Native American art and was a reflection on American colonialism. So to have something that really, to me, is a throwback to like 1970s art worker movement, when you have these large scale metal sculptures that are like heavy and made by a white man from the American West, right? Feels very reactionary in a way, I think, that speaks to our politics in a really serious way.
I'm curious where you'd place it on the attention economy grid.
I mean, I'm open to discussion on this, obviously, but I have it in the upper left quadrant because this is a real story. This is a real thing that's happening. But I think that this art is boring angle is noise that's covering up the signal of the jury quitting and the fact that we're there at all and the fact that the selection process was such a disaster. So that's really where I'd put it.
Akin, do you have thoughts about this?
I was actually going to move it slightly further to the right towards signal, but that makes sense based on what you were saying, where the actual signal is like being buried by the noise of the boringness of the exhibit itself. Maybe appreciate is the wrong word, but it does just feel like a microcosm of the Trump administration on every single level, from the original jury quitting to the appointing someone whose most recent experience was running a pet store to someone else who was fired for being like racist. Like, it just feels like all these things that we've been doing, or the Trump administration has been doing, so like including Israel and Russia. It's just like, it almost feels like an art piece in itself. Like someone is trying to just recreate the insanity of the administration while producing the most boring possible art at the same time. I'm assuming all layers of this are unintentional, but it just is a matter of just life becoming art.
I will also say the other thing that's interesting to me is just like glancing a little bit at some of like the information that's available online about the sculptor Alma Allen is like, some people like compare some of his work to Osamu Noguchi, which is interesting because I feel like Noguchi is like an explicitly political artist. Like, he's somebody whose work like grapples with like the legacy of race and racism in America. And like, we think of him as this sort of titan of sort of like modernist furniture, but he has this like longer art practice that was really grappling with, especially the racial politics of the time that he lived. And there's something that's like deeply perplexing to me about being like this sort of like white guy who lives in the American West, who also Wikipedia tells me actually lives and works in Mexico right now.
Mexico. Yes. Yeah. So he's from, I believe he's from the American West, but is currently working in Mexico City, which is another thing that also, I think, to your point, echoes this idea of like, this is a microcosm of the Trump administration.
Yeah.
Right, where it's like, we're going to expropriate things from you and talk about how your art doesn't matter. And like, yeah.
But I think this makes sense where you've put it, that like there's a way in which I think we can learn something about what's going on in the world through this story, for sure. Akin, I referenced that you were tired this week, and I know your first story for us is a little bit about why you're a little tired this week. Tell us about Chris Rabb's primary victory this week.
Yeah, Philadelphia just elected Chris Rabb to the United States Congress in the bluest district in the country. It's so blue that there's no Republican running in the general election. They're just like, why? And so essentially we've just elected a new socialist to Congress, which is amazing. And he has arguably further left politics than most of the people we would see as democratic socialists. He believes in right to return for Palestinians, for example, and has pretty just solid foreign policy in a way that I'm not worried about him around foreign policy issues, which is really refreshing. And, or just like for this Congress, especially, where, you know, even some of the Democrats, believe it or not, have been like, war with Iran, it's just the wrong time for it, kind of framing, as opposed to like, this is
right.
a thing we shouldn't do, really. So Rabb's campaign was also a defeat of two establishment-friendly candidates. You had Ayla Stanford, who was a doctor under Joe Biden during the COVID days, and was also just, ran a great campaign at first, but was very much exposed for having, the opposite kind of foreign policy prowess as Chris Rabb, just kind of flip-flopping on everything and making a claim that saying the word genocide was equivalent to saying the N-word. So she was at first seen as like the progressive in the race along with Rabb. And then the establishment quickly backed her, roughly around the same time that she's made that comment, oddly enough. And then you had the super establishment candidate, Sharif Street, who was literally the son of a former mayor who the FBI ended up establishing an office in City Hall to track and investigate his office. So not even like a normal establishment figure, but just like old school, corrupt Philly establishment. So Rabb ended up winning by 15 points, which was a shock to a lot of people, including myself. I thought he was going to win, but not necessarily by that large of a margin. And it feels, like a substantial victory for the left of Philly, especially as we ran a mayoral campaign as like the progressive left recently and lost. And, I feel like watching Mamdani from afar, I was getting a little jealous, not going to lie. Like New Yorkers left to dunk on Philly. So I was like, okay, y'all got us on this. So this just felt like a nice victory for us as a left here. And I also think it's a pretty substantial victory for the rest of the country too, where it shows that just door knocking, collaborating with social media influencers in a useful way. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about that with Hassan Piker, or potentially, because Hassan played a role here and came down to Philly to say hello and ended up bringing in, I think, a couple hundred people to a rally who were just inspired by his presence and Rabb's presence and Rabb's campaign. So it was just like this beautiful merger of kind of like influencer culture that I have criticized heavily in the past, old school door knocking, coalition building, and it added up to crushing a Democratic Party machine that really thought it was invincible. And I think that is, huge for everybody.
Yeah. I mean, it's a really exciting story. On election night, I was at this conference in Minneapolis and we were heading back from a drag show. And I happened to open up my phone to check because I was like, oh, it's election night. It was election night in a couple of places. And people were fired up at this conference of people who are not necessarily electoral politics people, I think it meant something to folks beyond people who pay a lot of attention to electoral politics too. So. Where would you place Rabb's victory on our grid here?
I am biased. I did spend 10 hours in a day on my birthday canvassing for him. So it feels like high reality tip-top reality. I want to say maybe halfway towards the whole right of Signal, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what gives you pause about its signal placement in terms of being just pure high reality, high signal?
I think there is a reality that we're in Philly and we do have a large left here. It's just been a left that has not worked together that much yet. We have a lot of potential. And I think this is starting to show the potential, but I'm not sure if the scale of this left exists throughout the country. And I also know that even other places that it does, like California, for example, as a state, it looks as though y'all are struggling to mount any substantial progressive in the gubernatorial campaign. I think it shows potential for the future and gives us more direction of how we can win, the kind of candidates that can win, and the reality that we can still crush machines like we've seen in New York and Chicago. But there is still the question of is this another anomaly? Admittedly, it's just another example, so maybe it's not an anomaly anymore. But there is, it's not Philly isn't the most normal of cities. We do have Elmo, who walks around all the time in Philly with a marching band and occasionally goes to riots.
I'm personally also really interested in this sort of again, here's an example of somebody who is able to leverage sort of influencer culture and online culture and combine it with a powerful organizing base that is echoes of the Mamdani campaign. And something that we've talked about on the show a lot is that I think there were always these breathless headlines about Zoran is so mediagenic, he's so good on social media, whatever, that did sort of like smooth over the fact or like get people to look away from the fact there was this, 100,000 like door knocking volunteers is just like wild infrastructure. And so I do wonder if there is something to this that is also not just a signal about the like political direction of the country, but about like, here's a model for like how you run a winning outside candidate. So I'm kind of curious about that. I don't know. Dr. Shan, I see you nodding. I wonder if you have thoughts about this too.
But no, I'm fascinated by both, bringing together different left coalitions and mobilizing social media and door knocking in-person community-driven campaigns. I think all that is exciting to see.
Cool. I'm happy to put this here. I do think it's like pretty high reality also, not just because like Chris Rabb actually won, but also that there's maybe something replicable here in this model. The first story that I want to talk about is unfortunately a really sort of sad and tragic and kind of scary one, which is obviously this story about the San Diego mosque shooting. There are a lot of kind of angles to talk about this from. And one of the ones that has been on my mind is, this conference I was at in Minneapolis was specifically a conference about building the power of trans people in our society. And one of the things that has been on a lot of people's minds is like the way in which a lot of like right-wing grifters and also this administration is trying to make it seem like mass shootings are largely committed by trans people, which like, I mean, I feel like it goes without saying that that's bullshit. And at the same time, like the people who committed this really just like heinous act of violence were avowedly white nationalists, right? It's like they're actually in a lot of ways espousing a lot of the same ideology that this administration either explicitly or implicitly promotes. And one of the things that this has gotten me thinking about, in addition to just, it feels like the war in Iran plays into this stuff. It feels like, I don't know, there's just like a way that I feel like we're living through a recapitulation of the post 9/11 moment in a lot of ways, and in a lot of scarier ways, because the surveillance apparatus is already there. But I really have been thinking a lot about what it means that there's this uptick in white nationalist violence from these people who are just so extreme that they're like, we need to commit these acts of terror basically to like incite a race war, that's like explicitly their thing. That like, is it that they think the white nationalist government that's in power is like not doing enough to like advance societal collapse? And I think that there's something it makes me very uncomfortable. I really kind of like don't know what to make of it, but the fact that like, I think at the beginning, and certainly in the first Trump administration, we talked a lot about the way in which Donald Trump's rhetoric and his policy gave cover to a lot of these kinds of nihilistic white nationalists. But that like in this moment where it feels like the state is really reaching towards more and more destructive and frankly like just like policies that kind of accelerate social collapse in a lot of ways. What does it mean that these kinds of folks still feel like they need to go shoot Muslims, shoot Black people, shoot trans people as a way of like accelerating that social collapse that they're looking for? I don't know. I'm really upset about it. It's really grim. I don't know that I have an answer to that question, but it's something that I've been sitting with a lot since the news of this shooting broke. That like, I don't know if it's that it's changed, but like my understanding of it feels like it's shifting.
Wait, shifting how?
In the sense, I mean, this thing about like the fact that these like white nationalist terrorists feel like they need to like continue to go out and kind of like incite the race war when like their people are in the highest echelons of the government. It feels like there's an interesting tension there that, I don't know, it's like they're not satisfied with the amount of suffering that the Trump administration is creating. And so they have to go out and create more. Or they want it to be like an all-out explicit race war, not just like something that is potentially like enacted through policy and social death. And this is a story that I do feel like is like pretty high signal, right? That it's like there is something happening here that these folks feel like they need to go out and like self-destruct in order to incite a race war. But I also think it's like, it's kind of below the x-axis, like it's in conspiracy zone. Because again, I think that like, for those of us who are grappling with the effects of the Trump administration's policies, like a lot of the stuff that they want is sort of being enacted, but the reason that they behave the way they do is conspiratorial. Like it is based in conspiratorial thinking.
This is a tiny bit tangential, but one of the things that I was struck reading about this story is how this kind of nihilistic politics doesn't neatly conform to, right, like traditional conservatism, and even mixes in things you wouldn't expect. A lot of my research as a professor is around environmentalism, and how we come to see ourselves as certain types of environmental citizens through popular culture. And one of the things that a lot of these manifestos have in common, way more than you would expect, is that there's a lot of deep ecology references in it, that some of these people committing these horrendous acts of violence feel very deeply about like preservation of national lands in ways that echo some far left environmentalist tendencies. But the reason that they're doing it is this kind of blood and soil logic. So it's a deeply racist form of deep ecology that is about preserving natural spaces for white Americans. And it's fascinating because it confuses people online, right? Because people will be looking for deep ecology content and be drawn into these racist spaces. And so I just think the nihilism inherent in this that like just pulls from wherever it can and isn't neatly, like Republican or that kind of thing, but is something further right, further to the end of the spectrum, and incredibly nihilist is depressing and hard to understand.
Yeah, it does feel like it's being produced by the political system, and not just Trump, but I actually think the entire political system, where we're living at an age where it's clear that we have vast amounts of abundance, yet we're seeing people be murdered on Instagram. People are growing up with access to such like high levels of violence that I feel like we had access to when we were younger, but it's just getting worse and worse, and there's more and more content. I think we're just at a moment in which humanity is faced with the reality that we haven't really solved the questions of nihilism philosophically. Like life can easily feel and appear meaningless when you have this vast amount of information at your fingertips at all times. And that things are, it's incoherent. You're living in a country that told you that, freedom is important, loving your neighbor, while you're also being told that it's okay for your neighbors to be kidnapped. And there's just so many layers of inconsistency that come from liberalism, that come from conservatism. So it makes sense that people are confused. Like there is this no guiding ethos to our society in any real way anymore. And I think I feel like there's been terrible guiding ethos, more puritanical views. But we're just at a point where we're all just kind of living in these little isolated bubbles and having to grapple with like the meaninglessness of it all alone to a certain extent. Maybe that's too extreme of a take. But I guess I was thinking recently we're all just consuming our own media every single day. Like no single human in the United States is getting the same information in a 24-hour span as any other human on Earth or in the United States. And that's like a unique time. So like we're grappling with like the ability to like go to space, the ability to own a yacht while people are starving, while we are like, dealing with just like the chaos of our own lives. Like if someone is in your family sick, you can't afford healthcare. This isn't to make excuses for people's actions, but to say that I think a lot of Americans in general are feeling lost and feeling the chaos and the overwhelm. So it makes sense that a lot of other people, like a small minority within that, is also feeling a sense of anger and hatred that is turned outward as well as inward, and acting on that while taking like little bits and pieces of ideology from the far right and whoever seems. I feel like edginess is something that people who are often like lost, especially at that age, are attracted to. And I think the right and the kind of like misanthropic kind of internet like weirdo subculture is really attractive to those people. I feel like those kind of things existed when I was younger too. Like I dabbled in chat rooms and forums, but what exists now is just kept getting worse. Like I remember just like vaguely just dodging 4chan and like one day checking 4chan because I had friends on there. I was like, oh my God, thank God I dodged this. Like, thank God I had nothing to do with this. And like, spent more time on like Reddit eventually, which is also has been a cesspool for a lot of this and has been a pipeline that leads people down further, terrible roads. So it does feel like, I don't know, that it just speaks volumes about the crisis that humanity is in as we're watching the planet, not die, but become less suitable for our own existence. And we're all kind of just grasping for meaning while there are people like our government who are, very hell driven towards a certain direction that includes a lot of chaos and destruction that I think people find attractive and alluring.
I find that to be helpful, actually, in terms of like what makes sense to me about how to think about something like this. That like, and I think what I hear you saying, Akin, is that this is more about the sort of like social crisis that underlies the political crisis that we're in, right? That it's like this is in some ways symptomatic of the fact that just voting MAGA out of office is not going to solve the problem, right? The problem is about these like really important existential questions about how we want to live together, both in a like material way, but also in a cultural way that I think are really what's being contested right now in a lot of ways. Dr. Shan, you have also another story that is about culture and also culture in public that I think is really great.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about this video game installation on the National Mall in Washington.
So the story that I want to talk about now is really continuing a long and illustrious legacy of prank art, basically. So in the past month on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., these video game consoles, like old school 80s, yep, there it is, popped up kind of beautifully situated at the DC War Memorial, right south, I believe, or east of the reflecting pool that just got painted. And they free open to the public. People have seen National Guardsmen playing this, which I think is a really interesting angle on this. But the game, this kind of 16-bit old school video game, is called Operation Epic Furious. And in it, you play as Trump, basically like starting and trying to accomplish different things with the Iran war, right? It leans heavily into satire and irreverence and that kind of thing. So it begins where you're Trump in the Oval Office and Hegseth, who is like pacing around frantically, is trying to get you to go into Kid Rock's helicopter so that you can go to Iran yourself. But along the way, you have the option to burn Epstein files, to talk to various members of your administration. And one of my favorite details is that one of the options is Melania is there. And if you attempt to hold Melania's hand, that's one of the choices you can make, you get a game over screen. I think it's the only way the game actually ends, because appropriately, you cannot win this game. Basically, you end up in this endless cycle where you're in Iran trying to get lube, which is what they're calling oil for some reason. And once you collect that, then the strait opens and then it immediately closes again. You have to kind of like weave back and it's circular. I think it's really clever beyond just the kind of, authoritarian figures hate being laughed at. And so it's usually a very effective tactic with them on some level. What's neat about this is the form is as important as the content here, because the military uses video games for recruitment, right? And a lot of pro-war propaganda comes in the form of video games. And so there's something really interesting here about playing a video game that pretends to be about like this exciting military operation, but instead is about the absolute futility and absurdity and futileness of engaging in these kinds of colonial military operations. It was made by an anonymous artist collective called The Secret Handshake. Nobody knows who is behind it exactly, but I just think it's really fascinating. They've done other stuff too. They put a gold toilet by the Lincoln Memorial. They are responsible for the striking sculpture of Trump frolicking with Epstein that was on the mall for a little while. And I'm kind of a big fan of prank art in general. So I was really tickled by this story. And I love that you can just go online and play this game too, that it's accessible, that you don't actually have to be situated in, DC in order to know what this is all about.
Yeah, this is amazing. Where do you think it falls on this grid as a story?
I think that there's something lightly signalish about this. I think that it has something real to say about the futility and violence and colonialism and circular nature of what we currently see ourselves embroiled in. I am interested in the kind of conspiracy aspect of this too. It hints at like nefarious. I mean, all the reasons I think for doing what we're doing are fairly nefarious, but some like more conspiratorial, alternate reasons for doing what we're doing. And there's also this kind of conspiratorial aspect to the fact that this artist collective is completely anonymous as well. So that's where I'd put it, but I'm curious to see if you guys agree or if you'd place it somewhere different.
Yeah, Akin, do you have a thought about where you'd place this?
I've been going back and forth about this. I was definitely moved by the National Guards people like playing that more towards signal than noise. But sometimes I get afraid that these things just feel just so like small in the face of Trump's like barbarity.
Sure.
That I get so excited and then I'm like, oh, Trump doesn't care. Like, and people aren't going to be moved that much by this. But at the same time, there is this feels like I was saying this in another, I think maybe on a Block and Build episode where it's like, it's just so hard to capture this administration and this like political moment through art, it feels like, or at least through music, in a way that it felt like capturing the Bush years was a lot simpler. And so stuff like this feels like it actually does grasp it more by like itself being a video game, by being like the placement of it, by it being accessible, and by the just absurdity of the game itself and what appears to be like the inability to win and like the only ending being like trying to hold Melania's hand. It's stuff like that I'm like makes me feel more like signally that it's like, okay, this is something in this moment that can like at least serve as like some sort of artifact. So like maybe 50 years from now, when like rebellious teenagers are sitting in their room smoking pot, like this is what they're playing instead of like listening to like anti-war music. They're like, oh yeah, I remember that time like people stood up and like this is like the art and like this is how we remember and reminisce. So yeah, the placement feels right to me though.
Well, I think it's really important to name that I don't think that this is going to materially change anything for us right now. I see this as a continuation of traditions like Dada art and Surrealism after World War I and World War II, where even though that art felt absurd, we really look back on that period and the sort of manifestos associated with it to think about how grand narratives about progress and humanism had failed, and how leaning into art that highlights the patent absurdity of history and human impulses and that kind of thing says something true about opposing ideologies in that moment. People who are still trying to buy into narratives that are about like great nations furthering history and progress, and having people who kind of see through that, looking at the mass death those narratives and those people have caused and being like, I'm going to thumb my nose at you in this way that acknowledges futility on some level, but also is about sort of rejecting the mainstream ideology of like very serious people in power doing very serious things that just lead to misery for huge swaths of the Earth's population.
Yeah, I was also stoked about this because I hadn't heard about it yet. And so this is my first encounter with it. And I used to teach critical video game studies to undergraduates when I was in grad school. And like, this is exactly the kind of thing that we would talk about a lot. Is that like, what are the things that this medium gives us access to and allows us to communicate that is like different than other forms of media? And I do think that like, there's some thought going into this game design that is like trying to get people to live through that a little bit.
There's a lot of research that immersive experiences, like having an avatar and playing a video game, help deliver information much better than, just sort of obviously fact dumping or presenting a story through traditional forms of media, because more of your brain is activated. And when things feel like play or are humorous or are cognitively estranged, that can also bypass some of our identity-based cognition in which we accept or reject facts based on, who we are rather than what is true. I mean, I think I want to caveat that by saying, like, this video game is not going to cause mass defection from
Right.
the right, but there is. I just always, it is always close to my heart to advocate for the fact that culture does influence politics and change people's minds, and is an important component to shifting ideology, since politics are really downstream of ideology.
Akin, I'm really glad that you have brought this story to us, because I feel like it hasn't been getting a ton of play about basically Trump's fund for his political allies. Can you tell us a little bit about this and this like IRS agreement?
Yeah, it's been on my mind a lot, partially because I'm hoping to get a cut of this somehow. Yeah, so Trump is basically, or has settled a case with the IRS where he sued them, and they settled out of court, and the judge approved the ending of the case without knowing about the settlement, which is wild. And so the Department of Justice has cleared $1.776 billion as a special fund for.
Why does it always have to be a meme?
I know. Yeah, I didn't realize the 1776 thing until an article pointed it out. And I was like, oh, yeah, he would do that. That makes it's annoying. And it's for those who've been wrongfully targeted by the government, which is being perceived as essentially for Trump's political allies. Like the founder of My Pillow has already spoken up with the desire to claim his share of this. And yeah, it is kind of maddening, since they seem to find like a weird legal loophole to just pay off a lot of people, including potentially participants of January 6th. And the law, or like the fund, also includes, which it's interesting reading about this, because everyone's just basically like, we don't know if this is legal. It's probably not. We're not sure what we can actually do about it. Because it also includes a caveat that the IRS can't investigate Trump, his family members, or any of their business associates for any tax violations in the past. Their tax history can no longer be investigated according to this. So it feels like Trump has just created another legal layer of legal immunity for himself, while also creating essentially a slush fund for anyone who feels wronged by the US government that he agrees with. And that decision will be held by a 5-person board that will be appointed by the Treasury Secretary, I believe, and one by Congress, though Trump has the ability to fire any of the 5 people at any moment that he so desires. So yeah, it feels substantial, because there's not a huge list of people that would qualify for this. That at least in terms of what people are, how we're interpreting this thus far. So this could potentially mean millions of dollars for individuals that were involved with January 6th, for example. A group of people that includes white supremacists and active militia members, which I think is kind of terrifying. So Trump has created, not only a sense of immunity for people who are willing to act out in his name, but now has also created a financial incentive for doing so, or at least a guarantee or promise that if you do something, you get caught, you might even get paid for it. So it does feel like a pretty big deal to me, and quite a lot of money too.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels very grim. I don't know. It's like going back to what we've been talking about the sort of like, like betting market websites. It's like the insider trading is now happening on the outside. It's like this feels like another iteration of outsider trading to me. Where does it live on this grid, I think, is the question, because I feel like I could argue for it being anywhere.
Yeah, it feels above the reality line, maybe like 38%. That feels like a random number. Or maybe 17.76% above the reality line.
Beautiful. Chef's kiss.
I mean, I would say further to the right, as far right as possible for Signal. But I'm not fully sure about that. And I think reality is that it still could be challenged in courts. Hypothetically, I mean, the legal experts that I've read on this, they're shrugging right now. Seems to be the consensus of like, we don't really know what to do or what happens next, which is alarming. It's the biggest potential hurdle it was facing was the initial judge of the case simply blocking it from happening or refusing to end the case and suspend it. But that didn't happen. The judge wasn't told about the settlement, suspended the case, and doesn't seem to be doing anything, or might not be able to do anything now. So it feels like they just did like a very sneaky little thing here. That's going to be complicated as a challenge. And anyone that wants to challenge it will have to essentially prove that they're being wronged by the existence of this fund, which will also be a hurdle. So it looks like the best chance of that will be DC police, who can claim that this is incentivizing further attacks on them by January 6ers, which is like an okay argument. I don't know if that would actually stand up, but who knows? It also depends on which judges end up handling different parts of this in the future. And signal-wise, it feels like a strong signal of this continued unabashed power grab by Trump, that I think he's very set on holding on to power in some form or fashion after 2028, whether or not it's him or a replacement. And he's setting up a lot of pieces to ensure that he has an extremely loyal base that will follow him into the fire and the flames.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And it's like another lever he can pull even when he's outside of office in a lot of ways. I don't know. Dr. Shan, you have thoughts about this?
I'm just continuously flummoxed by things that clearly seem like they should be illegal, that people are just like, no, well, nobody's ever tried that before, so maybe there's not a law about that. I'm just like, wow. I mean, if we know we need systemic overhaul, and this is just another example of why that is, and why it's not just Trump, but is like, he's showing us some serious holes in the way our laws and government are constructed.
Well, I do really want to talk about the Hasan Piker of it all, because it feels like we are in a moment where online influencers are simultaneously so powerful, right? Like people are kind of trying to make them out to be incredibly powerful. We've talked on this show before about how it's wild that the United States Congress has been able to come together across party lines to contemn Hasan Piker in this time of like, there are so many other really major things going on, y'all, that like really need your attention as legislators. And at the same time, I've been noticing a lot of how sometimes folks on the left are also overstating the influence that influencers have or can have. And, in some ways, this like loops back to the conversation we were having about Chris Rabb's victory, that like, what is the power that folks who make content on the internet have over voter bases, over constituents, and like what is the relationship ultimately between the discourse, quote unquote, and what actually happens in our shared political life. I think that it's interesting that Hasan Piker has decided that he's going to hit the campaign trail with progressive candidates all across the country, right? He was in Michigan, he was in Philly, he's been in several states in places where people are running, like contesting primaries. And it certainly is like grabbing headlines and people's attention. But again, I'm like, what are the limits of overstating the power of influencers in our shared political life. Like, are they actually getting people to go out to the polls? And I also think the sort of dark side of this is here in California, speaking of our like very frustrating gubernatorial election, there's some reports that came out in the past couple of weeks about Javier Becerra's campaign, or the PACs that are backing Becerra, paying influencers to basically just talk shit about Tom Steyer. No fact check. There's like no real evidence that any of it's grounded in reality, but like they're people who have pretty big audiences and are just kind of saying whatever. Again, not disclosing where they're getting money from, but it's from, a pro Becerra PAC. And, they create this sort of like comms crisis for a campaign that's like, well, what do you do in response to this, right? It's the kind of thing where like, if you issue a response, then in some ways it validates the accusation, but also most people who encounter that content are not sort of like looking for this longer trail of like, where is this information coming from? And I do feel like we're kind of in a moment where being an influencer who takes money from political campaigns or who's weighing in on political campaigns it feels like kind of a perfect storm of like their increased relevance and also like kind of like mainstream reporting's interest in what they're doing. And there are just no rules around how any of this works. They are kind of free to do whatever and take money from whoever. And the like mechanisms by which sort of like dark political money can be moved through the system makes it so that it can be very hard to trace why anybody is endorsing which candidate and for what. Yeah. So I'm really interested in this because I don't know that it's settled at all. And I do think that like it is in reality world, but like I can't tell if it's noise or signal yet. In some ways it's like too early to call. And I'm curious what each of you think, like where along the x-axis this falls. Dr. Shan, you have thoughts about this?
I have a lot to say about this one. Let me begin by disclosing very clearly that V. Spehar, who does Under the Desk News, has been my best friend for 25 years. And we co-host a live stream called Fool Me Once on Mondays, where we talk about culture and politics together. I have been around most of these people. They are in my like general community, not Hassan Piker. I don't know him. I've never met him. But like Ms. Frazzled and Politics Girl and all those people are like, I'm like 2 degrees from most of these people. I think it's a double-edged sword here. I think that, and again, I'm noting that I have bias because I personally have come to trust one of these people over 25 years and know their character very well. And that's not necessarily how other people should be judging, who they encounter online. I think that content creators who are in politics and media need to be looked at individually because they're not even doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
It is all over the map as to whether it's punditry or breaking news or curation of stories you haven't heard, and everybody has their kind of niche, right? So like Aaron Parnas, who does breaking news, and V like are often lumped together as, new media journalists, but they do very different things. So on the one hand, before we even get to money, I have had a lot of insider conversations about how new media and trad media work together or don't work together. Right. And so I think that there's distrust there. I think even the word influencer is really fraught in a lot of different ways and can be very dismissive, right? Because it sounds like you're selling something and that's not necessarily the case, right? Like I get called an influencer, which is fine. I get it. But to me, content creator or, like new media X, Y, or Z is more appropriate because this is like a very expensive hobby for me. And I do it because as an academic, the average academic journal gets read by 6 people. Whereas, I can have conversations with people who are not in academia about the usefulness of cultural theory. I can have my ideas challenged, right? It is much more of a conversation, much more like the conversation around citizen scientists, right? Like all the good work that was done in Flint and that sort of thing. I think one of the great things about traditional media is there are standards and vetting and an understanding of where the money comes from and that kind of thing. I also think with a lot of traditional media, they are beholden to having certain kinds of relationships with politicians and that sort of thing to continue access, right? So, I mean, on the one hand, like you don't know what's going on behind the scenes as much, but we've seen things like Mrs. Frazzled, who is an educational and political content creator, who basically is responsible, right, for completely shaking up the California gubernatorial election because she did, sourced research where she vetted stories and came up with credible evidence of, sexual assault. And then once she gathered all that evidence, then it went to CNN and CNN got a lot of credit for it, right? But nobody would touch that story. And she actually did good, like journalism around it that ended up transforming the landscape, right? And like I've personally seen V like hold Chuck Schumer to account to his face in a way that I have not seen traditional media do, right? So there's that aspect of it where I think we don't really know what this looks like yet because it's so new. But my personal opinion is that this has an important role to play because though trad media is a bulwark against certain things, I think it also has shown that it has severe weaknesses in the past decade or so. And when it comes to money, right, this is also a really interesting thing. Because again, I was like, the chorus thing was happening around me, the funding for left-wing creators. We know that the right wing is being funded by a ton of dark money, right?
Mhm.
The right wing content creation influencer ecosystem they've flooded the zone with like well-paid people. So on the one hand, I worry about where money comes from. And like V was not a part of the chorus program or anything like that. But on the other hand, I mean, you guys know it takes a ton of resources and time and energy to do this kind of thing. And people should be paid for their work. Right. And so I think that one of the things, especially in the last year that's going on here is it's like, how does that look like? Where is it coming from? What does disclosure look like? What do standards look like in these spaces? Is there any way of enforcing them? So I don't so much have an answer, but like there are so many facets of this that I think are really, really interesting.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. And I think the like reframe around we do need to be thinking about kind of like genre and like the nature of the content that people are creating is really, really important because like the Sarah content creator story is very much about people who are like not super political content creators being paid to suddenly make political content. And it feels almost like similar to the kinds of interventions people are trying to make around AI literacy, where it's like, if you see something coming from an account that doesn't normally post this kind of thing, what does that say to you, right? Like it's almost like a basic media literacy thing that's like, who is saying this and why do you think they're saying it and what is the context in which they're saying it? But like so much of that context is sort of like intentionally obfuscated by the platforms themselves that it's like it can be very hard when you're just like on the scroll to like have discernment about who's saying what and why. And then the fact that like there are a lot of folks who are, at least trying to make content creation like a side hustle and trying to like make ends meet in some ways with a hobby that like, we saw also with that Illinois House race with Kat Abu-Ghazala that like the influencer who was paid to kind of talk shit about Kat was like, I didn't even know that this was where the money was coming from. Like the source of the money itself was kind of obfuscated by I don't remember if it was a PAC or what that was paying her to kind of like put out like a reel that was like a hit piece on Kat Abu-Ghazala. I feel for a lot of these influencers too, the content creators who are like, have smaller audiences who maybe are like, they're trying to build an audience and they get approached and like, how do you navigate that as like an individual or just like one person and like a couple friends? Like it seems really, really, really thorny.
And it requires media literacy, right?
Yeah,
like
on every level.
Totally.
Akin, do you have a thought about? I mean, certainly also a thought about like the role that Hassan Piker is playing. Also,
Yeah, I feel like I am biased since my super PAC is funding him. But it feels like he played a pretty positive role in Philly. Like he didn't make or break the campaign by any means, but it feels like different organizations and individuals played key roles, like Working Families Party, Reclaim Philadelphia, DSA. I feel like we hit different demographics of people, and you had like Summer Lee come in at some point. And I feel like Hassan brought in a lot of young people, young progressives who otherwise might not have voted, who might share the politics of Chris Rabb, but kind of just saw, the election as just like another thing that happens to be happening. I just remember the day that Hassan came, I had a lot of friends who at that point I hadn't talked to about the campaign, who weren't that like interested in it, suddenly texting me and asking me if I was going to the rally or not. And I was like, oh, like I'm not going to go to the rally because I'm like, I just canvassed and I need to take a nap. But it made sense that a lot of other folks, that was like their first point of engagement with the campaign. And then the canvasses that happened that day were also huge too. Mm-hmm. So there was also an impact on the ground game too. So like, I think it was definitely a positive development, and he wasn't the only content creator involved either. So we had like a lot of more Philly-based people who also played different roles. So it just feels like another kind of thing we would want to consider when figuring out like what bases we need to reach and who to target, is like, like what creators are these bases looking at, and what are the other ways, like, like what bus stops are they going to, like what neighborhoods can we find them. It's just like another factor of campaign mapping, I think.
Yeah, totally. I think that like based on this discussion, I do want this in the reality and signal quadrant, in the sense that like I think that this is increasingly going to be a feature of our political landscape. But I think, yeah, closer to the center there than these other two stories makes sense, because like I think that all of these sort of like complex manifold factors in the way that content creators interact with political campaigns, interact with sort of traditional media, is just like, it's a non-Euclidean, this is non-Euclidean geometry. Like there's like so many aspects to it. There's so many different surfaces. And I think that one of the things that seems to me to be true is also, as both media makers and media consumers, we need to be thoughtful about how we talk about this stuff as well. That like overstating the influence of a content creator on a campaign doesn't help the hard work of the organizers who are really like building the base in a serious way. And understating the power of content creators also leaves power on the table in a lot of ways, and creates an opening for the far right to potentially siphon off folks who might be sympathetic to our ideas. Well, this has been a delight, y'all. I feel like I'm pretty happy. I'm interested that we didn't end up with a noise conspiracy story this month. But I also think that there's been a lot of like real shit happening. There are also a lot of stories that like I was like, oh, we should talk about this, that we didn't get to. I mean, I think the big one that I'm just like, ooh, I got to put a pin in this is Louisiana versus Calais and the State of the Voting Rights Act. Is like a lot of things are happening. And I think there's like also a lot of commentary about democracy dying, when in reality, there's all these things are live and contested. So I'm sure we'll have time to get back to this at some point in the coming months. But yeah, Dr. Shan, thank you so much for joining us this month. It was a delight to chat with you. And I think the stories that you brought to the table are also really interesting. And I hope our listeners feel like they've sort of like got a different angle on some of the stuff that's happening. So
this was such a great conversation. Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun to talk to you.
And Akin, always a pleasure. My thanks again to Shannon Mancus for joining us this week. We'll link to her Instagram and also her YouTube show, Fool Me Once, in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. Kimmy David designed our cover art. Convergence Magazine is a proud founding member of the Movement Media Alliance. And of course, if you liked what you heard, please let us know. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes, tell a friend, or rate and review the show wherever you listen. It really helps us find new audiences, and it means a lot to our small team. And of course, if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/membership. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure that we can continue to build this map for our movements. And I hope this helps.